Title: The Burnt Wings. Chapter 1: The Hollow Village. Evelyn stood at the edge of the village, the faint scent of burning wood hanging in the wind, curling around her like the whispered secrets of those who had passed through this forsaken place before her. She had come here seeking answers, but she hadn't expected to find a place so consumed by silence. There was no chatter in the streets, no children running after stray dogs, no laughter, only the deep, ominous quiet that seemed to swallow up the very life of the village. It was as if the world had forgotten it, or worse, had chosen to forget. Her boots scraped against the cracked, weather-beaten cobblestones as she walked deeper into the village. The homes here looked like they had been abandoned long ago, though a few flickering lights in the windows suggested otherwise. A cold, creeping dread settled into her chest as she moved forward. The darkened windows stared back at her, empty eyes that watched without blinking, as if the whole place were alive and breathing, waiting, patient and aware. She could hear them then, the whispers, soft and distant at first, just a fluttering of words too faint to make sense of. But they grew louder with every step she took, the voices curling around her like invisible threads, brushing against her skin. The air itself seemed to thicken, vibrating with a strange energy she couldn't name. The deeper she went into the village, the more the whispers changed, becoming garbled and frantic, as if they were trying to tell her something, or warn her. You shouldn't be here. The words weren't spoken aloud, yet Evelyn could hear them as clearly as if they had been. The voices were no longer distant. They were right beside her, all around her. She turned sharply, but the street was empty. No one was there. Her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time since she'd arrived, a deep, chilling fear gripped her heart. She pressed forward, trying to ignore the sensation that the village itself was watching her. She had come here because of her brother, his strange disappearance 2 years ago, his journal, and the cryptic messages he'd left behind. Everything had pointed to this place, and now the village seemed to be testing her resolve, pulling her in deeper with every step, as if it knew why she had come, as if it had been waiting. Turning a corner, Evelyn found herself in front of a small, dilapidated chapel. The roof was sagging, the windows shattered, and the wooden doors were warped and decayed. Yet despite its ruined state, there was an undeniable pull, an undeniable force that urged her to step inside. The chapel seemed familiar to her. Though she had never been here before, something about it whispered to her, as if it held the answers she sought. But the whispers, those soft voices that had been growing louder, had stopped. The quiet was almost suffocating. Evelyn pushed the doors open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the darkness within. It was cold, colder than she expected, and the scent of dampness filled her nostrils. Her flashlight flickered briefly before the beam steadied, casting long shadows against the stone walls. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw them. Carvings on the walls, strange and ancient, their meaning lost to time. They were symbols she didn't recognize, though a part of her instinctively understood them. The angels, the figures were everywhere, etched into the very bones of the chapel. At first glance, they appeared to be delicate, angelic beings, their wings spread wide, their faces serene. But upon closer inspection, the serenity was shattered. The angels were scorched, their wings burned to blackened stubs, their eyes hollow, staring into the void with a sadness that twisted Evelyn's stomach. And there, among the carvings, was a symbol she recognized, a symbol from her brother's journal, a sigil drawn in a crude, hurried hand, repeating over and over again. It was the same one he had written in his final days, just before his disappearance. She had thought it was just a sign of his growing madness, a meaningless obsession, but now it seemed to make sense. She had found it, but there was something wrong with this place. The air seemed to press against her skin, heavy with an unnatural weight. Her pulse quickened, and her breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer to the altar, the one at the center of the room. A circle had been carved into the stone, and within it was the same sigil, as though it had been drawn there with blood. As Evelyn's fingers brushed against the stone, the ground beneath her feet shifted. A low rumble, like the distant growl of an animal, vibrated through the floor. She froze. The whispering voices returned, louder now, as if the walls themselves were speaking to her. The angel's eyes in the carvings seemed to follow her every movement. Suddenly, a figure stepped from the shadows. A man, tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and dark, sunken eyes. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his movements were unnaturally smooth, like a predator stalking its prey. He didn't speak, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic. He raised his hand slowly, pointing toward the altar. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured, his voice a rasp like the sound of dry leaves scraping together. "They know you're here." Evelyn's throat tightened. She could hardly breathe. Fear coiled in her chest, choking her. Her mind screamed for her to turn and run, but her body refused to move. Who are they?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The man stepped closer, his hollow eyes never leaving hers. He didn't answer directly, but instead pointed again, this time at the altar. "They will burn you," he said softly, almost tenderly, "just as they burned me. And your brother." Evelyn felt the words like a physical blow, her heart shattering in her chest. Her brother. He had been here. He had been part of this. His journal, the sigils, the angels, all of it was connected. But to what? What was the truth behind this village? These angels? This man? The man's lips curled into a thin smile, showing yellowed teeth. "You're too late, Evelyn. The fire has already begun." And then the ground rumbled again, louder this time, as if the very earth was waking up from a long, deep sleep. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, one by one, their forms illuminated by the flickering light. They were angels, but not the kind she had imagined. Their wings were burned, their bodies broken, their faces twisted in agony. They were not creatures of divine beauty, but beings of torment, cursed to remain in this place forever. Evelyn's legs trembled, and for the first time, she felt the overwhelming urge to flee. But as the angels closed in, she understood that there was nowhere left to run. Evelyn's mind spun, racing to make sense of everything around her. Her thoughts were a jumble of confusion and panic. Who was this man, and what had he meant by, "The fire has already begun"? The air in the chapel felt thick, pressing in on her chest as though the very walls were alive with hunger, with malice. The angels, those grotesque burned figures, seemed to shift in the shadows, their movements subtle but unmistakable. She blinked, and for just a moment, one of the angels smiled. A horrifying thing, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, like a predator preparing to feast. Her heart thundered in her chest, and her legs refused to obey her command to run. The man, no, the thing, was still standing, watching her with eyes so deep and hollow that it felt as though he could see into her very soul. His lips twisted into a smile, one that held no warmth, no comfort, only the promise of something far darker. "You feel it, don't you?" he whispered, his voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "The pull, the hunger. It's here, inside you." Evelyn wanted to scream, to shout at him to stop, to make sense of all of this, but her throat was dry. She could barely breathe. The words caught in her chest, like something trying to claw its way out. Instead, she clutched the edge of the altar, grounding herself, steadying her breathing. "Who are they?" she gasped, struggling to find her voice. The words felt heavy in her mouth. The man chuckled softly, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "Who indeed?" He stepped closer to her, his feet making no sound against the stone floor. He moved like a shadow, too fluid, too unnatural. "They are the ones who burned us all. They are the ones who brought us here and keep us trapped. They are the Devourers." The way he said it, so matter-of-factly, made Evelyn's blood run cold. Devourers. The word echoed in her mind, settling into her thoughts like a poison. She glanced at the angels again, their broken wings and shattered bodies now more than just images on the walls. They were alive in a way, their faces twisted in eternal torment, their eyes following her, pleading with her, warning her. Evelyn's pulse quickened, and she dared to take a step back. But her foot slipped, her heel catching on the edge of the sigil carved into the stone. She stumbled, but before she could regain her balance, a sharp pain shot through her leg, radiating outward like fire. She gasped, dropping to her knees, her hands instinctively clutching at her calf. The pain was excruciating, a sharp, burning sensation, as if her skin were being seared by hot iron. She looked down, expecting to see something, an injury, a wound. But there was nothing there, no mark, no blood. But the pain didn't stop. It pulsed and throbbed with an intensity that made her head spin, and she felt an icy hand wrap around her heart. The whispering voices returned, louder than ever, filling her ears, drowning out everything else. "Help me, help me, please, help me." Her head snapped up, and for a moment, she swore she saw the angels' eyes widen, their faces contorting in agony. She saw them move, no longer just carvings, but creatures, twisted and horrific, reaching out toward her with burnt skeletal hands. "You're too late," the man said again, his voice cold and unfeeling, like the wind blowing across a graveyard. "The fire has already claimed you." She felt it then. It wasn't just the pain in her leg. It was in her chest, in her bones, deep inside her. Something crawling, something hungry. She could feel the burning, like the fire was already inside her, working its way through her veins, devouring her from the inside out. "No," she screamed, shaking her head, trying to push the darkness away, but it clung to her like a shadow, tightening its grip. The man's expression remained unchanged, his face as cold and distant as the stone walls around them. "The angels can't save you now. None of us can be saved. Not anymore. The fire is too far gone." Evelyn felt her head spinning, her vision swimming with black spots. She wanted to run. She wanted to get away. But the chapel had become a prison. The walls were closing in, and the air itself seemed to be thickening around her, suffocating her, choking her with its unnatural weight. The angels' eyes, those hollow, empty pits, were watching her, waiting. She could hear them now, louder, clearer, their whispers rising above the chaos in her mind. Their words were not meant for her ears. She wasn't supposed to hear them, but somehow they were inside her head. "Join us!" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, and it was so familiar. She knew that voice. It was her brother's. Her breath caught in her throat. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice shaking with desperation. The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "He's here, Evelyn. He's with us." Her stomach turned. The name echoed in her mind like the sound of a bell tolling for the dead. Suddenly, the walls seemed to shift, warping and rippling like liquid. The floor cracked beneath her feet. A gust of wind, cold and unnatural, blew through the chapel, extinguishing her flashlight and plunging the room into total darkness. And then, nothing. Silence. The whispers ceased. The angels ceased. Even the man was gone, leaving nothing but the haunting echo of his words. But Evelyn could still feel them. The angels, the fire, and Tommy. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she struggled to stand, pushing herself off the cold stone floor. The pain in her leg was gone now, but something far worse had taken its place. An overwhelming sense of being watched. The presence in the room was suffocating, and just as she began to move, a low, guttural sound filled the air. A growl, deep and inhuman. It came from the altar. She turned toward it, every muscle in her body frozen with fear. Something was moving in the shadows, something large, something alive. Then from the darkness, a figure emerged, tall and hunched, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It was like a man, but not quite. A twisted mockery of a human form, cloaked in shadow, with limbs that twisted and jerked unnaturally. And in its mouth, Evelyn could see the faintest traces of a smile, as if it recognized her, as if it had been waiting for her to arrive. Chapter 2. The echoes of the fallen Evelyn didn't know how long she'd been standing there, her body stiff, her senses overwhelmed. The chapel was no longer just a building. It had become a labyrinth of terror, an oppressive force that squeezed the air from her lungs with every breath. She could still feel it. The eyes of the angels, those things that had once been celestial figures, pressing down on her, watching her with an unblinking hunger. The man, the one who had whispered to her in the dark, had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but the burning echo of his voice. But it wasn't the man who haunted her now. It was the eyes, those hollow eyes, stretched wide in eternal agony. Evelyn could feel them on her, crawling under her skin, sinking into her thoughts. "They know you," they whispered. "They know what you are." Her heart beat wildly in her chest, but her legs refused to move. The chapel had become something alien, its stone walls now seeming to twist and grow around her, a living, breathing entity that pulsed with dark energy. There was no escape. There was nowhere to hide. She was surrounded, encased in a prison of her own terror. "Help me." A voice, soft and trembling, echoed from somewhere within the darkness. Evelyn froze, her hand instinctively going to her mouth to silence the scream that threatened to escape. The voice was familiar. It sounded so much like her brother's, a whisper she remembered from childhood, one she had hoped she would never hear again. "Tommy," she whispered, her throat tight with fear. She took a tentative step forward, her breath shallow. "Tommy, where are you?" The voice came again, faint but unmistakable. "Evelyn, help me!" She couldn't tell if it was real, if the voice was really coming from somewhere in the chapel, or if it was just another trick of her mind, her fear manifesting. But something deep inside her told her to follow it, to find him. With every step, the darkness seemed to swallow the light, the chapel closing in like a noose. The cold grew more intense, as though the temperature itself was bending to the will of something far older and far darker than anything Evelyn could understand. Her breath turned to mist in the air, and the walls seemed to whisper in a language she couldn't comprehend. The shadows were alive, writhing and twisting like snakes, and she couldn't help but feel that something was waiting for her. The silence that followed the voice was suffocating, a heavy, crushing silence that pressed against her ears, against her mind. Evelyn's pulse hammered in her head, each beat louder than the last, until it felt like the chapel itself was alive with the sound. She wanted to turn back. She wanted to run, but there was something in her gut, an instinct, a deep-rooted need that pushed her forward. The voice continued to call to her, growing more urgent with each passing moment. "Please, please, Evelyn," it pleaded, the words crackling with static as though it were struggling to break through some kind of barrier. "They won't let me out. They—" Suddenly the ground beneath her feet trembled, a low growl vibrating through the stone. Evelyn stopped dead in her tracks, her legs locked in place. The shadows flickered, and for a split second, she thought she saw something, someone, in the corner of the room. But when she blinked, it was gone, vanished into the inky dark. She felt the air shift then, a sudden rush of cold sweeping over her skin, sending a wave of goosebumps across her arms. The whispers grew louder, like a chorus of voices from beneath the earth, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. They weren't human voices. No, these were something else. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. "He's here," the voice again. It was Tommy's, but it sounded different now, distorted, warped. "Come closer, Evelyn." With a feeling of dread pooling in her stomach, Evelyn forced herself to move, each step slow and hesitant. She knew she was being led somewhere, but she didn't know by what or who. There was no escape now. The chapel had become its own twisted reality, a world of darkness and whispers. She finally reached the altar. The stone steps felt cold beneath her feet, colder than anything she had ever felt before. As her fingers brushed the worn stone of the altar, a shock ran through her body, like electricity, but far worse. It was as though she had touched something alive, something that wasn't meant to be touched. The altar was etched with symbols, arcane symbols that seemed to pulse with their own energy. As Evelyn's fingers traced the markings, she felt a presence behind her. She whirled around, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing just outside the circle of light from her lantern, was the figure of a man. His face was obscured by shadow, but the shape was unmistakable. The same man who had been there earlier. The same one who had whispered those ominous words. "You should not have come," he said, his voice deeper now, layered with a strange echo, as if multiple voices spoke through him at once. Evelyn felt her body freeze, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. "What? What do you want from me?" she managed to ask, her voice shaking. He stepped closer, the shadows clinging to him like a cloak, like a living thing. His smile was twisted, unnatural, stretching across his face in a way that no human smile could. "You're already too late," he whispered, his voice slipping into her mind, winding its way into her thoughts like a serpent. "The fire. It's begun. There's no going back." Evelyn took a step back, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the altar, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel it now, deep inside her, the hunger. It was like a cold flame, burning within her, gnawing at her insides. It was the fire he had spoken of, the one that had already begun to consume her. She could feel it rising, crawling through her veins, spreading like oil across her soul. The man's smile deepened, and his eyes, those hollow dark pits, seemed to grow larger, sucking her in. "They can't save you, Evelyn. The angels can't help you. You're already one of us." Before she could react, the chapel seemed to shift once more. The walls groaned, the shadows swarming around her, swallowing the light. The whispers grew louder, closer, until it felt as though they were inside her head. She couldn't escape them. She couldn't escape him. And suddenly, it wasn't just the chapel that was alive. It was everything. Her breath quickened, her hands shaking as she tried to break free from the suffocating grip of the darkness. "Please," she whispered, but the words came out choked, strangled. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the presence was gone. The figure, the whispers, the pressure, everything. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, feeling like the ground beneath her was shifting, crumbling, disappearing into the void. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't obey. She could barely think, barely breathe. The chapel was silent again, but the air was thick with the remnants of something. Something darker, something that had touched her very soul. And deep in the silence she could hear it. Faintly but unmistakably. The whisper. Her brother's voice. "Help me." But now it didn't sound like him at all. Now it sounded like them. Chapter 3. The Binding. The air felt thick, almost solid, as Evelyn sat on the cold, uneven stone floor of the chapel. Her heart raced as her trembling hands clutched the lantern tightly, the flickering light casting erratic shadows that seemed to twist and writhe around her like sentient beings. The silence was deafening now, so absolute it felt like the world itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something, something that could not be named. The whisper was gone. Her brother's voice, distorted and twisted, had faded into the depths of the darkness, leaving behind an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on her chest. But even though the words had stopped, the presence remained. She could still feel them. The eyes. The cold, hungry eyes that watched her from every corner, from the very walls themselves. There was no escape. For a long while she did nothing but sit there, staring into the dark, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The chapel had become a prison. Every direction led her deeper into its grasp, and every step seemed to pull her further from reality. She could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on her, the ghosts of those who had come before her, trapped in this cursed place. And now, she realized with growing dread, I am one of them. Evelyn shuddered at the thought, feeling a cold chill crawl up her spine. She reached for the lantern, its weak light barely pushing back the oppressive shadows, but it was enough to reveal the altar once more. Its cold, unyielding surface marked with those strange symbols. The symbols that, when she had touched them earlier, had sent a shock through her body like nothing she had ever felt before. She wanted to turn away. She wanted to run. But she knew deep down that there was no escape. Not from the chapel. Not from the shadows that lurked within. And most definitely not from them. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the fear that had settled deep inside her chest. For a moment, The silence pressed in even heavier, suffocating her. But then, just as the weight of it was about to crush her, there was a faint sound, a soft scrape, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her heart jump into her throat. Evelyn snapped her head toward the source of the sound. Her breath hitched as she saw a figure standing at the far side of the chapel, barely visible in the gloom. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, the shadows playing tricks on her mind. But as her eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer, more distinct. It was a woman. No, not a woman. A thing dressed in tattered white robes, her skin pale and stretched too thin over bone, the faint outline of her ribs visible under the fabric. Her face was covered with a veil, and her hands hung limply by her sides, as if she were too weak to lift them. But it wasn't the appearance of the figure that unsettled Evelyn the most. It was the way she moved, or rather, the way she didn't move. The figure seemed to glide rather than walk, her feet never quite touching the ground, her body swaying with a strange, unnatural fluidity. Evelyn could feel the coldness radiating off her, even from a distance. It was like standing in the presence of something ancient, something that had existed long before the world as she knew it had come to be. The woman, or whatever she was, wasn't human. Not anymore. Without a word, the figure began to move toward Evelyn, her every step echoing in the stillness of the chapel. The air grew colder with each passing moment, the temperature dropping rapidly, as though the very fabric of reality was thinning around them. Evelyn's mind raced. What was this? Was this the same entity that had spoken to her earlier? The one that had been watching her from the shadows? Was this her brother? Her body tensed, and instinctively, she pulled the lantern closer, as if the weak light could offer some kind of protection. But she knew, deep down, that it wouldn't. The figure stopped just in front of her, and Evelyn couldn't help but notice the twisted smile that tugged at the corners of her lips. It was a smile that didn't belong on a human face. It was wide, stretching too far, too unnaturally, until it was almost painful to look at. Her eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were nothing more than empty, dark voids, sockets devoid of life. But the smile was filled with malice. A hunger. "You should not have come here, Evelyn," the figure whispered, her voice distorted, like it was being spoken through 1,000 different mouths at once. "You have awakened us." The words sent a shiver of terror down Evelyn's spine. She didn't know what it meant, but she could feel it, deep in her bones. There was something ancient, something wrong, happening around her. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows began to creep closer, encroaching on her, swirling like smoke. "You cannot leave now," the figure continued, her voice growing more insistent, more threatening. "We are bound to this place, Evelyn, just as you will be. The moment you set foot inside this chapel, you became one of us. You cannot escape what has already begun." Her words were like a weight on Evelyn's chest, pressing down until she could barely breathe. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled back, instinctively trying to put distance between herself and the thing that stood before her. But it was useless. The air was thick, oppressive, and the figure was already too close. "The fire has already begun," the figure repeated, her voice a mocking whisper. "It will burn everything, Evelyn. Everything you love, everyone you have ever known. And then, when it is done, it will be your turn." Evelyn's eyes widened in horror. "My turn? What do you mean? What's going to happen?" she gasped, her voice trembling. But the figure merely smiled again, that horrible, twisted smile, and stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as she had appeared. And with her disappearance came an even heavier silence, deeper, darker, suffocating. Evelyn was left standing alone in the chapel, her body shaking, her mind reeling. Her brother's voice, her fleeting hopes, all shattered in an instant. It had all been a trap, a lie, and now she could feel it, the heat, the fire. It was starting, just as the figure had said. The chapel had become alive with it. Chapter 3. The Binding. The chapel was colder than it had been before. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, thumping like a heartbeat, steady and deep. Evelyn could hear it, the slow, relentless rhythm echoing in her mind, reverberating in the very marrow of her bones. The air itself seemed to thicken around her, pressing in, suffocating her with its weight. She tried to ignore the growing dread gnawing at her insides, the sharp pinch of fear that had been with her ever since she stepped into this forsaken place. She told herself it was just her imagination, that there was no real threat. But as she looked around, the chapel seemed to distort. The high arches of the ceiling curved in on themselves, becoming more oppressive, like the ribs of a great beast, closing in around her. Her pulse quickened. Stop it. Just focus, she told herself, trying to steady her breathing. She squeezed the lantern tighter, its faint light flickering as if it, too, was afraid. The shadows around her stretched unnaturally, warping and twisting like living things, reaching toward her with an almost malevolent intent. She was no longer alone in the chapel. Even though her mind screamed that she should leave, that she should run far away from this cursed place, her body seemed rooted to the floor. She had no idea why she had come here, but it felt like something inside her had already made its choice. She couldn't stop herself. Something had drawn her here, some invisible hand tugging at her soul, urging her to uncover the truth behind the whispers that haunted her. Evelyn had never been the type to believe in ghosts or curses. She had always brushed those things off as superstition. But here, in the stillness of the chapel, the unease that wrapped around her like a shroud made it impossible to dismiss the notion. There was something here, something ancient and powerful, and it wasn't interested in letting her leave. Her eyes fell on the altar again. The symbols carved into its surface burned with a ghostly glow, like the embers of a fire long extinguished, yet still glowing faintly. The pain in her head intensified. It felt like a pressure building up inside her skull, as if her brain was being crushed, squeezed by unseen hands. She could feel the thrum of the energy, vibrating in the air, in the walls, in the ground beneath her feet. Evelyn's fingers twitched as if pulled toward the altar, toward the symbols. She resisted for a moment, but the compulsion was strong, stronger than her will. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. The floor beneath her feet creaked and groaned as if protesting her movement, but she didn't stop. It was when her fingers brushed against the altar that the world seemed to stop. Her vision blurred, and her heartbeat pulsed in her ears. Her hand was frozen against the cold stone, the symbols beneath her fingers searing her skin with a hot, sharp burn. A sound, low, guttural, began to reverberate through her chest, as if her very soul were vibrating in tune with the chapel. It was like the air itself had become alive, stretching, reaching for her. And then she heard the whisper. Not from the air, not from the shadows. It was in her mind. Evelyn! Her heart skipped a beat. She yanked her hand away from the altar as if burned, her breathing ragged, her body trembling. She whipped her head around, but there was nothing behind her. The chapel was empty, save for the thick, suffocating darkness pressing in from all sides. The whisper had come from the air, from the walls. She could still hear it. It was faint, like the flutter of a moth's wings, but it was there, in the very fabric of her mind. Evelyn, come closer. It wasn't her brother this time. It wasn't a voice she recognized. This was something older. It was a voice that spoke to the marrow of her being, a voice that drew out her deepest fears and whispered them back to her in a mocking, familiar tone. Her chest tightened, her heart slamming in her ribs. She wanted to scream, to run, but the air around her felt thick, as if the very atmosphere had become a prison. She couldn't move. You should not have come here, Evelyn. The voice again, colder this time, and more commanding. The air crackled, alive with some ancient energy, and Evelyn felt it, pulling at her, tugging at the very essence of her being. She wanted to scream, to beg for it to stop, but her throat felt tight, constricted, as if something was pressing against it from the inside. She could feel the pull in her chest, in her heart, like something was wrapping itself around her soul, slowly tightening. A cold, invisible hand was reaching into her mind, wrapping itself around her thoughts. You were always meant to be here, the voice continued, and it was almost as if it were savoring each word, dragging them out, letting them resonate in her soul. This was never a choice. This was fate. You are part of us now. Evelyn's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the stone floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind felt as if it was splitting, torn between the present and something older, something more terrible. She could still hear the whispers, the mocking tone. The chapel itself seemed to groan in answer, as if the building itself were alive, waiting. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something moving in the shadows. Something or someone. Her breath hitched as she turned her head. There, standing just inside the darkened doorway, was a figure. Tall, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden beneath the hood, but the presence of the figure was unmistakable. The air around it seemed to warp, and the ground beneath its feet cracked and moaned in agony. The figure moved closer, slowly, silently, its every step seeming to draw the very darkness closer, consuming the light. Evelyn tried to rise, to run, but her legs felt like lead. She could barely make a sound, her mouth dry, her throat tight. Then, as the figure drew nearer, it spoke, not in words, but in a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the floor and into her bones. The sound seemed to make the chapel tremble. You were meant to join us, the voice came from the figure. But it was not human. It was distorted, broken, as if the voice were being spoken through countless other voices, layered one on top of the other. The ritual has already begun. Evelyn's eyes widened in horror. The figure reached out, its hand moving slowly, as if savoring the moment. The fingers, long and skeletal, seemed to stretch toward her, reaching for her soul. In that instant, Evelyn understood what was happening. The chapel, the altar, it wasn't just a place. It was a gateway. And she had been drawn here not by some accident, but by design, by something ancient, something that had been waiting for her to cross its threshold, to step into its dark embrace. The figure reached her, and without warning, its hand gripped her arm. The cold that radiated from it was unbearable. It burned through her flesh, deeper than her bones, sinking into her very soul. And then, just as she thought she could bear no more, the pain stopped. The darkness surrounding her seemed to ease, and the figure stepped back, its hollow eyes fixed on hers. It said nothing else, only nodded, as if something had been accomplished. Evelyn collapsed, gasping for breath, but the words still echoed in her mind. The ritual has already begun. Chapter 4. The Unseen Hand. The world beyond the chapel door was no longer a sanctuary. The soft whisper of the wind outside, which had once been calming, now carried an ominous undertone. Evelyn could still feel the chilling touch of the figure's hand, as though the coldness of it had seeped deep into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. Her mind raced, her thoughts fractured like shards of broken glass, slipping through the cracks of her consciousness. She stumbled back into the nave of the chapel, but the room felt wrong. The once welcoming darkness now seemed to pulse with a strange, malevolent energy, as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing, watching her every move. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling, yet there was no escape. She was trapped in a place that had no mercy, no end. Evelyn's hands clutched her chest as though to steady her racing heart. Every footstep felt heavier, the ground beneath her feet feeling less solid with each passing second. She tried to call out, but her voice was strangled, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. Her surroundings were a blur of shadow, the dim light of the lantern barely piercing the oppressive dark that surrounded her. But then, in the silence, came a sound so faint, so subtle, it almost seemed like a trick of the mind, a faint scratching. It was coming from the walls. At first, she thought it was just the sound of her nerves playing tricks on her, the rustling of old wood or the settling of the structure. But no, this sound was deliberate. It was rhythmic, a scratching, followed by a dragging sound, like nails or something far worse, scraping against the stone. Evelyn's blood ran cold. No, it can't be. The air in the chapel seemed to thicken, a stifling weight pressing against her chest. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but her feet remained rooted to the ground. She couldn't look away from the walls. The scratching continued, closer now, and Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest, nearly deafening her with its frantic beat. Her pulse rang in her ears, matching the growing rhythm of the noise. She could feel something, someone, moving just beyond the reach of her vision, hidden within the stone. And then, without warning, the first of the shadows emerged. It slid from the cracks in the walls, long and sinuous, like a living thing. A tendril of darkness that writhed and twisted as though it were part of the very fabric of the chapel. The shape was impossible to define, but Evelyn knew it was not a trick of the light, not her imagination. Her breath caught in her throat. She could not move. Her body was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so primal, so deep within her core, it rendered her motionless. The shadow began to stretch, elongating, reaching for her. Its tendrils twined and twirled like a serpent, and as it neared, Evelyn could feel its presence, the suffocating, invisible weight that pressed against her skin. The air grew colder still, and she could hear her heartbeat, slow and hollow, like a drumbeat marking her descent into something far worse than death. A whisper, "Evelyn!" It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The voice was familiar yet foreign, like a memory that was slipping just out of reach, something she had known once but could no longer grasp. "Come closer, Evelyn." The voice echoed through her mind, invasive, suffocating. It felt like the walls themselves were speaking to her. The darkness was speaking to her. She wanted to scream, but the words were stuck, caught in her throat, unable to escape. Her legs shook beneath her, but still, she could not move. She could feel the pull of the shadow, drawing her in, like a moth to a flame. Her body was betraying her, her own limbs refusing to listen to her desperate thoughts. The shadow reached toward her with an unnatural speed, its blackness consuming everything it touched. "Do not resist, Evelyn." The words echoed louder now, a cacophony of voices layered one on top of the other. Each word was like a blade, carving through her mind, deep and unforgiving. Evelyn's vision blurred as if the world itself was warping, bending around her. The shadow was closer now, just inches from her skin. She could feel it, the cold, unnatural presence pressing against her, as though it wanted to pull her into its depths. Her breath hitched in her throat, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Then, just as the tendril of shadow touched her, there was a sharp crack, like the snapping of a branch, and everything went still. The shadow recoiled. The air in the chapel shifted. The weight that had pressed down on Evelyn's chest was lifted, but the silence was deafening. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, an instinctive sense of danger tingling down her spine. And then she heard it, a low growl, a vibration in the air, so deep it resonated in her bones. It was coming from behind her. She whipped around, her breath ragged, eyes wide with fear. The shadows had gathered once more, swirling and shifting, forming something tangible, a shape, a figure. And then it stepped out of the darkness. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its form bent and broken, as if its body was not meant to stand as a human's. It was draped in tattered robes, the edges frayed and decayed, like they had been worn for centuries. The face was hidden behind a mask. No, not a mask, but a face, molded from blackened stone, its features cracked and broken, the mouth twisted in a permanent snarl. It had no eyes, only dark, empty sockets that seemed to suck the light from the room. "You are mine now, Evelyn." The voice came from the figure, but this time it was not spoken aloud. It was a thought, a feeling that flooded Evelyn's mind, like it was embedded directly into her consciousness. "You cannot escape. You are bound to this place." Her chest constricted in terror as the figure stepped forward, the air growing colder with each movement. The shadows curled around it like living creatures, writhing and dancing, eager to consume anything that came too close. Evelyn stumbled backward, her hands flying up to her face in an attempt to shield herself from the creature's presence. But it was no use. She felt it, the inescapable truth that had been gnawing at her since she had entered the chapel. There was no way out. She was already part of it, part of this cursed place. "You were always meant to be here," the voice whispered again. And this time, there was no warmth in the words, Only a cold, suffocating void. You have crossed the threshold. There is no returning now. The shadows in the room began to close in around her, thicker now, wrapping her in their dark embrace. They slithered across the floor, up the walls, surrounding her in every direction, suffocating her, until there was nothing left but the figure and its broken, hollow eyes. Evelyn could feel it. She could feel her very soul being tugged, pulled into the dark, her body growing weaker with every passing second. And she knew, in that moment, that she had become a part of the darkness, that she would never leave this place alive. The figure reached out with its cold, skeletal hands, and Evelyn felt herself being dragged forward, her body no longer in control, her mind slipping away. There was no escape. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. The air had thickened, suffocating and foul, like something stagnant that had been trapped in the chapel for centuries. Every breath Evelyn took felt like inhaling broken glass. The shadows that once simply lurked in the corners of the room were now moving, alive, insidious, weaving and twining like serpents eager to swallow her whole. The church had ceased to be just a building. It had become a living, breathing entity, hostile, hungry, and implacable. Evelyn's legs trembled beneath her as she backed further into the cold stone wall, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure, if it could even be called that, stood motionless, its broken, faceless form towering before her. The shadows roiled around it like a sea of black tar, clinging to its figure, as though they were drawn to it, compelled by an ancient power. She couldn't look away, she couldn't breathe. Her mind was slipping, fragments of thoughts scattered, some lost in the cracks of her fractured perception, others frantically struggling to stay tethered to reality. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a rasp. Her throat was dry, sore from the screaming she had not been able to do. She didn't even know if the question was for the figure or for herself. The figure's head, if that was what it was, jerked forward, its jagged, unnatural movement causing Evelyn to flinch involuntarily. The air around it seemed to shimmer, vibrating with a low, insidious hum. There was no voice, no spoken word, but Evelyn felt the answer in the deepest recesses of her mind. An answer that chilled her to the very core. "Because you were always meant to be here." Her legs buckled beneath her, and she sank to the cold floor, her palms flat against the stone, as if trying to push herself away from it. Her pulse raced, her heart thudded in her ears, sweat beaded on her brow, and her thoughts felt like they were being torn apart, broken and scattered by the force of the words that echoed through her mind. There was a long, suffocating silence. Then, the voice came again, this time louder, closer. "You are mine now." Evelyn choked on her breath, her chest tightening painfully. She felt a pressure building around her, as if invisible hands were clenching her ribs. The shadows twisted and writhed, like they were feeding off her fear, growing stronger with each passing second. She knew the creature was drawing closer, but her eyes refused to move from the shadowed form before her. She tried to push herself upright, her body protesting with every movement, her limbs refusing to cooperate, as if some invisible force was pushing her back, keeping her down, trapping her. The shadows, too, had grown bolder. They crawled along the walls, creeping toward her, swirling beneath her. "There is nowhere to run," the voice coiled around her like a venomous snake. "There is nothing left to fight. You are already here, and I will never let you leave." A cold, cruel laughter filled the room, the sound reverberating off the walls, warping, distorting as it echoed in her skull. It was not a laugh that belonged to any living thing. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had never been human. Evelyn's breath hitched, her mind clawed at the edges of consciousness, but she couldn't escape the suffocating grip of the shadows. They were closing in on her, and with each passing second, she could feel the weight of the dark power pressing against her, pulling her deeper, erasing her very existence. The figure moved then, gliding forward, its massive presence filling the space between them. The shadows receded around it, like a sea parting for a creature too terrible to behold. But the closer it came, the more she felt her own essence slipping away, her fear, her thoughts, her very sense of self. It was all being swallowed, consumed by the void that surrounded her. She reached out, desperately clutching at the stone floor, trying to ground herself, trying to remind herself of the world outside the chapel, the world that was slowly becoming a distant, forgotten memory. Why? Why me? She managed to choke out, her voice trembling as she tried to understand why it had chosen her. The figure did not answer with words. Instead, it reached out a hand, or what might have been a hand, and Evelyn gasped as she felt an icy chill touch her skin. The air itself seemed to burn, searing her as it passed through her body. She could feel herself being pulled toward it, toward the cold void that seemed to radiate from the figure. "Because you are mine," it whispered in her mind again, its voice now like an invasive thought clawing at her sanity. "You are the last piece I needed to complete the ritual. You are the final offering, and once you are gone, this place will be whole again." The figure's hand, no longer a hand, but a mass of shifting darkness, wrapped around her wrist, pulling her with a force that she couldn't resist. The shadows around her were consuming her, dragging her into the depths of their tangled grasp. The walls of the chapel seemed to close in, the air heavy and thick, until she could barely breathe. Her chest was suffocating under the weight of it all. Her body felt like it was being torn apart. She couldn't tell where her skin ended and the shadows began. Was she even still herself? Was she still human? Or had she become one of the shadows, one of the whispers that had once tormented her? "No!" she gasped, her voice a broken whisper. "Please, let me go." But the figure only tightened its grip. Its voice, now a cold, hollow thing, filled her ears. "There is no escaping me, Evelyn. You are already a part of this world. You have crossed the line. You have made the choice, and now there is no turning back." The shadows pressed in closer, suffocating her, and Evelyn felt herself being pulled deeper into the void. The darkness consumed her mind, her body, her soul, until there was nothing left of her but the remnants of a once living thing. And then, just when she thought she could bear no more, the shadows released her. The pain, the suffocation, the dread, it all vanished in an instant. Evelyn's body fell limp to the ground, her mind slipping into unconsciousness, but the darkness lingered, surrounding her, claiming her as its own. The figure loomed over her, its faceless gaze burning into her very being. It could feel her fading. Her soul was slipping away, but it didn't care. It would have her. In the end, it would have them all. Chapter 6. The Hollow Echoes. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the chapel, her mind a storm of disjointed thoughts, her body trembling as though it had been stripped of warmth. The darkness that had taken hold of the church pressed against her, tightening around her like the grip of 1,000 unseen hands. The shadows shifted, always watching, always moving, curling into the corners of the room, waiting for her to falter. Her legs were unsteady, weak beneath her, as if the ground itself was pulling her downward, urging her to fall into the abyss that lay just beneath the surface of reality. She could feel the temperature drop with every step, her skin prickling with cold. And yet, it wasn't just the chill that made her shudder. It was the oppressive weight of the air around her, thick with something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for her to cross the threshold. The low hum from the depths of the chapel had grown louder, more distinct. It vibrated in the walls, the floors, in the marrow of her bones. It was not a sound that could be heard by the ears alone. It was a sensation, a presence that seeped into her very soul. She could still feel the figure's presence, its unseen eyes upon her, watching her every movement, waiting for her to break. Evelyn clenched her fists, pressing her nails into her palms in an attempt to ground herself. The pain was real, but it was fading, losing its sharpness, as though the very sensation of pain was being numbed by the darkness that enveloped her. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing in sync with her own panicked heartbeat. She looked up, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw something flicker in the shadows. Eyes, bright and hungry, watching her from the darkness. She blinked, and it was gone. But she knew it had been there. She could feel it, Why won't you leave me alone? Evelyn whispered to the empty air, the question escaping her lips before she even realized it. The darkness seemed to answer her in the form of a soft chuckle, a low, distorted sound that reverberated through the chapel. It was not the laugh of a human being, but something far older, far darker. It was the sound of something that had existed long before her and would continue to exist long after she was gone. You have never truly been alone, came the voice, now clear and unmistakable. It was a voice that rattled her bones, chilling her to the very core. I have always been here, Evelyn, and now you belong to me. She froze. The words sent a ripple of dread through her, like a cold wave crashing against her spine. The figure, the thing that haunted the chapel, had spoken to her directly. It wasn't just in her head anymore. It was real. It was here. A shadow passed by her in the periphery of her vision. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, suffocating darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. Her pulse quickened as her mind raced, and she felt the creeping sensation of something crawling up her neck, the hair on her arms standing on end. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to offer her an escape. But the chapel was vast, its walls stretching impossibly high, and every corner was swallowed by the darkness. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. A sudden noise from behind made her spin around, her heart leaping into her throat. It was a whisper, a voice so faint that it could barely be heard, but it carried with it the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. Come closer! The voice beckoned, like a lover's whisper, soft but compelling. You cannot fight it, Evelyn. You cannot escape. With a breathless cry, Evelyn bolted forward, her feet slapping against the cold stone floor. Her mind was reeling, her body moving on instinct. But her movements felt sluggish, as if the very chapel was holding her back. She stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to catch herself on a nearby pillar. The shadows in the room twisted and writhed, forming shapes that seemed to mock her. They were figures, faceless and formless, their features constantly shifting, like dark clouds that couldn't quite hold their shape. They moved toward her, drawn to her fear, pulling her deeper into the chapel. Evelyn's breath quickened, her pulse racing as she tried to force herself to move faster, but the darkness was closing in. It was relentless, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing her path, and the shadows followed her, curling around her ankles, tugging at her. You cannot escape, the voice repeated, louder now, filling her head with a horrible pressure. You are mine now, Evelyn. You have always been mine. Her body felt heavy, like lead. Her legs shook with every step, and her hands felt cold, numb, as if they were no longer her own. The shadows were swallowing her, their tendrils wrapping around her, pulling her down into the depths. Then, a figure appeared in the distance, a silhouette standing in the center of the chapel. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form wrapped in shadows, but there was something different about it. The figure was no longer just a shape. It had substance, a terrible presence that radiated power and dread. Evelyn's heart froze. She knew this figure. She had seen it before, in her dreams, in her nightmares. It was the thing that had been calling to her, pulling her here. Evelyn, the figure said, its voice a rasping, hollow echo that made the air tremble. You belong to me now. Her eyes widened with fear. She knew now that she could never escape. She was trapped, bound to this place, to this thing. There was no way out. With every step she took toward the figure, the shadows seemed to grow stronger, more oppressive. They were everywhere now, a mass of writhing blackness, enveloping her, consuming her, until there was nothing left but the dark presence of the figure standing before her. You are the last piece, the figure whispered. The final soul I need to complete the cycle, the last sacrifice. And once you are gone, this place will be whole again. Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. She tried to move, but her body refused to respond. The darkness pressed against her like a physical force, pushing her toward the figure, toward the inevitable. I, she whispered, her voice trembling, her words broken. What? What do you want from me? The figure's head tilted, its faceless features shifting like smoke. It reached out, and Evelyn could feel its presence invade her mind, worming its way into her very thoughts. You are the offering, it said softly, its words like poison sinking into her soul. You always were. And with those final words, the darkness closed in on her, and Evelyn felt herself fading. Her body, her soul, everything she had once been, was being swallowed by the shadows, consumed by the very thing that had called her here. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the figure's form, standing tall and unyielding, watching her as she disappeared into the void. Chapter 6. The Hollow Echoes. Continued. Evelyn's mind was fraying, each thought unraveling with the slow, relentless pull of the shadows around her. It was as though she could no longer distinguish where her mind ended and the oppressive atmosphere of the chapel began. She was suffocating in this place, caught between the waking world and the suffocating grip of the unknown. Her breath came in jagged bursts, her chest tightening as if the very air had conspired to steal it from her. Every inhale seemed to bring more darkness, more weight. Her feet dragged across the cold stone floor, the sound of her movements drowned by the whispers that surrounded her. The chapel had become a living thing, the walls pulsating with a rhythm of their own, as if it were breathing, alive. And yet, Evelyn couldn't escape the feeling that something else, something beyond the chapel, was watching her, waiting, hungry. I have seen you before, the figure spoke again, its voice seeping through the cracks in her sanity, its words a thread that twisted into her thoughts. You were always meant to be here, Evelyn. You walked into this place not by mistake, but by design. Her eyes flickered to the towering figure in the distance. It stood motionless in the heart of the chapel, an unearthly silhouette that loomed larger the more she tried to make sense of it. Its form was blurred, as if it were flickering in and out of existence, just on the edge of perception. One moment, it was tall, almost impossibly so, a shape that stretched into the darkness above, and the next, it seemed to shrink, becoming a grotesque mockery of what it had been. A writhing collection of limbs, an entity composed of shadows and despair. Evelyn took another trembling step forward. Her body felt lighter than air, like a marionette whose strings were slowly being severed, one by one. The chapel's walls seemed to bend and sway, distorting her sense of reality. The echo of her footsteps was swallowed by the darkness, swallowed by the void that stretched around her. It was as though she no longer walked on the ground, but drifted, pulled by an invisible force. The figure spoke again, its voice as smooth as velvet, yet sharp enough to cut through the fog of Evelyn's consciousness. You never understood it, did you? The way the shadows have always followed you, the way they always watch. The voice seemed to emanate from every direction, whispering from the walls, from the air itself. You think you're alone. You think you can escape, but you can't. Not anymore. This place is your home now, and you are mine. The words settled over her like a cold shroud. It was true. She had always felt it, the lingering sensation that the shadows had been watching her, waiting for her. There were moments in her childhood, in the dark corners of her old house, when she had been sure that the shadows were moving, creeping closer, as though something unseen was observing her every step. She had dismissed it, told herself it was just her imagination running wild. But now, in this place, in this accursed chapel, those lingering fears had materialized into something solid, something that couldn't be ignored. Evelyn stumbled, a sudden dizziness threatening to undo her. Her vision blurred for a moment, as if her very mind was rebelling against the reality around her. But then it passed, the world snapping back into focus. The chapel was still there, its towering columns casting elongated shadows, and the figure, still standing, still watching, loomed in the distance. Her heart pounded in her chest, its rapid rhythm like a drumbeat, the only sound she could truly hear. The whispers around her had quieted, and in their place, an unnerving silence fell over the room. But even in the stillness, she could feel it. The weight of the chapel, pressing against her, the cold fingers of the darkness tightening around her throat. Why are you doing this? She forced herself to ask, her voice trembling. She didn't recognize it anymore. It was no longer the voice of a woman. It sounded raw, alien. "What do you want from me?" The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, it seemed to sway in the shadows, its form shifting and coiling like a living nightmare. Evelyn could feel the air grow heavier as it loomed closer, each step it took making the shadows around her grow darker, denser. "What do I want?" The figure's voice was like a sigh, a sound that reverberated deep inside her chest. "I want what you owe me." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, its movement like liquid darkness, smooth and unhurried. "You think your life is yours, don't you?" it asked, its voice now laced with mockery. "You think you control your fate, that you can choose the path you walk. But no, Evelyn. It has always been mine. You have always belonged to me, even before you knew it." Her breath caught in her throat. She recoiled, instinctively trying to retreat, but her feet wouldn't move. The shadows seemed to hold her in place, locking her in place like an invisible prison. She was a puppet, its strings pulled taut by the malevolent force that surrounded her. "You are a part of the grand design," the figure continued, its voice softening into a cold, soothing lullaby. "You were chosen long before you even realized. This is your purpose. This is your end." The words filled her mind, a fog that clouded her thoughts, clouded her vision. She had heard them before, in her dreams, in the moments when she thought she might be free. The whispers had always been there, circling around her like vultures, waiting for her to fall. Now, it seemed, the time had come for her to face them. The figure's shape grew more distinct, more defined, until it was standing before her, towering, its face still a blank canvas, but its presence felt as tangible as the ground beneath her. She could feel the weight of its gaze, though it had no eyes, no visible form of a face. It didn't need one. It knew her. "It's too late to fight," it whispered. And Evelyn felt the words settle into her bones, making her heart falter. "You were never meant to escape. You were always going to be mine." Evelyn's body trembled. Her hands shook uncontrollably, but she clenched them into fists, fighting the terror that clawed at her mind. She had to escape. She had to fight. But the figure only stared at her, unblinking, unyielding. "It's too late," it repeated. "You will never leave this place. You belong to me." The words were a curse, an unbreakable chain, and they reverberated through her mind like an endless scream. She could feel the finality of it, the weight of doom, crushing her spirit, eroding her will. In that moment, Evelyn understood. There was no escape. There never had been. Chapter 7. The Whispering Walls. The chapel was no longer a place of stone and structure. It was a labyrinth of suffocating blackness, a maze that twisted itself into corners that no longer made sense. Evelyn's heart raced, a frantic rhythm that echoed louder than her breath. She could feel the walls around her shifting, moving in ways that defied logic, reshaping themselves into towering pillars and narrow hallways, always closing in on her. She could no longer see the exits, nor could she remember where she had entered. It was as if the chapel had swallowed her whole, trapping her in its endless expanse of darkness. The figure, the thing that had haunted her since the first moment she stepped inside, was now everywhere. Its presence seeped into the very walls, into the air that she breathed. Its whispers curled around her like tendrils, burrowing into her ears, filling her mind with disjointed thoughts and twisted ideas. Every sound seemed to reverberate off the stone, echoing unnervingly. But it wasn't just the sound. It was the feeling that came with it. The walls were alive, breathing, pulsating with a dark life of their own. "You cannot escape me, Evelyn," it whispered again, the voice as sharp and smooth as a blade running across her skin. "You are mine, always." The words were a brand, etched deep into her psyche. She could feel them carving into her mind, etching themselves into her very soul. The shadows had begun to bleed into her thoughts, until she could no longer tell where the whispers ended, and her own fears began. Her eyes darted around, frantically searching for something, anything, that would offer her a way out. But all she saw was the same oppressive darkness, the same endless corridors of stone. And then, in the distance, the faintest glimmer of light. It was so small, so fragile, that Evelyn almost didn't believe it was real. Hope. The light beckoned her forward, flickering like a candle struggling to stay alight in a storm. But with each step she took, the light seemed to move further away, always just out of reach. The more she pursued it, the more the shadows seemed to close in, pulling her back, sucking her deeper into their web. "Where are you going?" The voice came again, mocking and cruel, coming from everywhere at once. It was the chapel itself speaking, the stone walls and pillars now alive with its presence. "You will never leave this place, Evelyn. You belong here." Evelyn's pulse quickened. She pushed herself forward, her legs like lead, unwilling to stop. She couldn't let the fear win. She couldn't let it drag her down into the abyss. With every step she took, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "I am watching you. I know everything about you. There is no place to hide." The walls trembled with the voice, vibrating so violently that Evelyn's teeth rattled. She stumbled, her knees buckling beneath her, and for a moment she thought she might collapse. But then she saw it again, the faint light flickering ahead. It was real. It had to be. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold stone, and for a split second, it felt like she had broken through. The air shifted, the darkness easing just slightly. She took another step, her body trembling, half relieved, half panicked. But as soon as she moved forward, the chapel responded. Crack. A horrible, sickening sound, like the tearing of fabric, echoed through the air. The light in front of her blinked out, snuffed out like a candle in the wind. Her breath caught in her throat, and then everything was silent. Evelyn stood motionless, unable to move. The walls had stopped shifting. The whispers had ceased. There was nothing but a stifling quiet. She dared not make a sound, afraid that even the smallest movement would shatter the fragile peace that surrounded her. And then, like a slow, terrifying realization creeping into her bones, she heard it. The scraping, the sound of something dragging itself across the floor, slowly, relentlessly. It started far behind her, too far to pinpoint the source, but it was coming closer, coming for her. Every second, the sound grew louder, more distinct, the drag of something heavy, something wrong, sliding across the cold stone, dragging with it the promise of something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching. "You should have never come here," the voice whispered again, now cold and dripping with malice. "Now it's too late. The walls are listening, Evelyn. The walls know your name." Evelyn spun around, but there was nothing. Only the shadows. Only the darkness that stretched out into infinity. She could hear her own breath now, ragged and shallow, as though her body itself was betraying her. And then the scraping stopped. The silence was absolute. For a moment, Evelyn dared to believe it was over, but deep down, she knew better. This wasn't an end. It was a pause, a lull before the storm. She could feel it. Something was coming. Something was here. It wasn't long before the walls began to change. The stone started to shift, moving of its own accord, like massive fingers curling inward. The chapel wasn't just a place. It was an entity, an extension of the malevolent force that had drawn her here. "You belong here," the voice crooned, no longer distant. It was right behind her now, breathing down her neck. "You belong to me, Evelyn. And this place will never let you go." Evelyn's heart raced as the walls seemed to close in around her. She could feel the weight of the stones pressing in, the air growing thick and suffocating. It was becoming harder to breathe, harder to think. But still, she ran. She ran deeper into the darkness, away from the voice, away from the scraping sound, away from the chapel that seemed to swallow her whole. Her footsteps echoed in the cavernous expanse, but no matter how far she ran, the darkness followed. No matter how fast she moved, she was still trapped. The walls, the shadows, the whispers, they were all part of it now, part of her. Part of the game she could never escape. Chapter 8. The Weight of Eternity. Evelyn's footsteps were slow now, heavy, like the weight of the chapel itself had seeped into her bones. Her legs shook beneath her as though they could no longer hold her up, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let herself rest. Every time she paused, the walls seemed to draw closer, their oppressive, suffocating presence closing in around her like a noose. The dark corridors twisted in on themselves, growing narrower with each turn, the stone shifting in ways she didn't understand. The chapel itself seemed to mock her, laughing at her futile attempts to find an exit. She had lost track of time, lost track of her own thoughts. All she knew was that she couldn't go back. She had to keep moving forward no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much her body begged her to stop. She stumbled again, her hands pressed against the cold stone walls for balance. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices scraping against her consciousness. They no longer spoke in words, but in sounds, in guttural, haunting noises that felt as if they were crawling under her skin. The chapel was alive, pulsing with a dark, malignant energy that drained her strength with every breath she took. "There is no escape," the voices hissed, their tones low and mocking. "You are here for eternity, forever a part of us." She pressed her hands harder against the walls, feeling them vibrate beneath her fingertips. The stone was no longer just stone. It was flesh, soft and pliable like human skin, its texture alien and unsettling. She recoiled in horror, pulling her hands back, but the walls seemed to reach out to her, as if they were alive and beckoning her to stay. It was impossible to breathe, impossible to think. Every corner she turned only brought her deeper into the heart of the labyrinth, deeper into its madness. The shadows crept closer. They were more than just shadows now. They were shapes, contorted and writhing, like figures caught in the act of becoming something else. She didn't dare look at them directly, but she could feel their eyes on her, feel their presence pressing down on her like a physical weight. They were watching her, studying her, waiting for her to break. And then, as if the chapel had been holding its breath, a new sound broke the silence. A child's cry. Evelyn froze, her body stiffening with dread. It was a sound she knew all too well. A child, crying out in fear, in pain. The sound came from the farthest reaches of the chapel, far down one of the darkened halls. She couldn't tell whether it was real or just another trick of the shadows, but something in her gut told her it was not an illusion. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound so loud in her ears that it almost drowned out the cry. She stood there for a moment, paralyzed. She wanted to run, wanted to flee from the sound, but her legs refused to move. The child's cry was so full of terror, so raw, that it tore at something deep inside her, something buried beneath the layers of fear and panic. She couldn't ignore it. Slowly, carefully, she forced her legs to move, one step at a time. The walls seemed to shift around her, closing in, as if the chapel itself were trying to stop her. But she pushed forward, ignoring the tightening pressure on her chest, ignoring the shadows that curled and stretched like grasping hands. As she walked, the cry grew louder, more desperate, until it seemed to echo from every corner of the chapel. But with each step, the sound began to change. It became less a cry of a child in fear, and more, something else, something wrong. The sobs became raspy, guttural, as if the child's voice were being distorted by something terrible, something unnatural. "Help me! Help me!" The words came now, faint and pleading, as if from somewhere deep below the chapel, from the very bowels of the earth itself. "Please, please, save me." Evelyn's breath quickened. She felt a surge of nausea rise in her throat, the oppressive weight of dread pressing down harder than ever before. The cry was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a cold, suffocating thing that surrounded her, seeping into her skin, crawling under her flesh. The walls shifted again. They moved with a sickening groan like something being torn apart. The sound filled the air, drowning out everything else. Evelyn stumbled, trying to keep her balance, but the world around her was twisting, warping, as though she were caught in a nightmare from which there was no waking. The child's voice, no longer a child's voice, ripped through her mind, driving the last vestiges of sanity from her grasp. "You are too late," the voice rasped, its tone now low and guttural. "I have been waiting for you, Evelyn, waiting for you to come to me." The voice was everywhere now. It was the chapel. It was the walls. It was the floor beneath her feet. It was the shadows, closing in on her from every angle. The air had thickened into something foul, something rotten, the smell of decay and death mingling with the suffocating presence of the chapel itself. Evelyn felt the tears burn in her eyes as she pushed forward, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her breath shallow and ragged. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the darkness. "It's too late," the voice whispered again, this time right behind her, so close she could feel its breath on her neck. "You've already chosen, Evelyn. You've already made your choice." Her mind reeled, her pulse racing. What had she chosen? What had she done? The chapel had always been a trap. But now she realized the truth. It wasn't just a place of shadows. It was a living entity. It had been alive all along. It had fed off her fear, off her despair, and now it was going to claim her, just as it had claimed so many before her. And then, through the suffocating blackness, she saw it. A figure stood at the end of the corridor, bathed in a faint, sickly light. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, bending at odd angles. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes glowed, a pale, sickly green that burned into her soul. It was no human. It was something much older, much more ancient. "Welcome home," the thing whispered, its voice a rasping echo that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the chapel. Evelyn didn't know what it was, but she knew one thing for sure. It wasn't just a creature. It was the very soul of the chapel, the darkness that had been here long before her, and would remain long after she was gone. She had come seeking answers, but she had found only one. There was no escaping the chapel, no escaping the darkness. Chapter 8. The Weight of Eternity continued. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest, and each breath she took felt like a struggle against an unseen force, the oppressive weight of the chapel bearing down on her with unbearable intensity. The air was thick, saturated with something ancient, something that whispered of forgotten sins and endless suffering. It wasn't just the darkness that threatened to overwhelm her now. It was the very building itself, as though the stones of the chapel had become sentient, aware of her presence, hungry for her soul. The figure in front of her seemed to grow taller, its limbs stretching and distorting as if the shadows themselves were reaching out to swallow her whole. The soft, raspy voice grew louder, more commanding, and Evelyn could feel the words like fingers pressing against her mind, prying into the deepest parts of her thoughts. "You should have known," it whispered. "You should have understood. This place does not let go. It consumes. It absorbs. It owns." Evelyn stumbled back, every instinct in her body screaming for her to run, but her legs were heavy, shackled by the unseen force that gripped her. She was rooted to the spot, her body rebelling against her commands to flee, her eyes locked on the shifting darkness before her. The thing, the entity, was alive, its features morphing and twisting with every passing moment. It was like staring into a living nightmare, one that had no end. The chapel seemed to pulse with a sickening energy, the air vibrating as though the walls themselves were breathing. The whispers, the distant voices, they had become louder now, a chorus of tortured souls, their cries seeping through the cracks in the stone like a terrible song, a lamentation for the lost. Evelyn could hear their words now, distorted and broken, but unmistakably human. They begged for release. They begged for freedom. "Please, don't let it take me." A voice, weak and pleading, reached her ears. The sound of it filled her with a horror she couldn't even begin to understand. She recognized it, the same voice she had heard the first night she stepped into the chapel, the voice that had seemed to come from nowhere. "It has already taken you," the entity in front of her crooned, its voice dripping with malice. "And it will take them too, one by one. It always does. Welcome to your eternity." Evelyn's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails biting into her palms. The voices, the whispers, the pleas. They were getting louder, swelling into a cacophony that rattled her skull, shaking her resolve. But beneath the terror, something else stirred within her. A spark, no matter how small, of resistance. She wasn't done yet. She couldn't let this thing claim her. She had to fight back. Her gaze snapped to the altar, a faint glimmer of light catching her eye. She had seen it earlier, but had paid it little attention. Now, it seemed to pulse with a strange, hypnotic energy, a beacon in the midst of the overwhelming darkness. Without thinking, she moved toward it, her legs heavy, but determined. Every step felt like wading through quicksand, each footfall sinking deeper into the ground. But she pushed forward, inching toward the light that flickered like a dying star in the midst of a storm. The air around her thickened, swirling with a palpable tension. It was as though the chapel was aware of her intention, its malevolent presence growing stronger with every step. The floor beneath her feet groaned in protest, the very stones of the building seeming to shift and move as if trying to prevent her from reaching the altar. But Evelyn didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her hand reached out, trembling, and touched the surface of the altar. Cold. The stone was ice beneath her fingers, sending a shock of icy terror coursing up her arm. But there was something else too, something different about it. A subtle pulse, a rhythm, a heartbeat. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The voices that had been tormenting her fell silent, and for a moment, the chapel felt eerily still. The oppressive air lifted, just for a fraction of a second. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, and she dared to glance around. The figure, the darkness that had loomed over her, was gone. "No," the voice from the altar whispered, its tone dark and full of ancient knowledge. "You cannot escape." Evelyn's hand trembled as it hovered just above the altar, the pulse beneath her fingers growing stronger, more insistent. She could feel it, whatever it was. An energy, a force, something dark and ancient that radiated from the altar like an endless well of power. But it wasn't just power, it was hunger. The chapel had fed on the souls of countless victims over the centuries, and now it turned its eyes upon her, waiting for her to make her move. "Please," Evelyn whispered, her voice hoarse. She wasn't even sure who she was begging anymore. The entity, the chapel, herself. It didn't matter. All she knew was that she needed to survive. She couldn't let it take her. Her fingers hovered over the altar's surface, the pulse beneath them growing stronger, like the beating of a heart, like something alive, something that wanted to consume her. She recoiled, pulling her hand back, but the movement felt wrong. She didn't know why, but the chapel seemed to respond to her fear. The walls groaned, and the air became thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadows began to gather once again, creeping toward her, wrapping themselves around her like living tendrils. "We will take you," the voice said, now no longer a whisper, but a low, guttural growl, a promise of the suffering that awaited her. "We have waited for so long, and now you belong to us." She looked around in desperation. The walls seemed to be closing in on her, the shadows pooling like ink, spreading across the floor, pulling her toward them, swallowing up the light. There was nowhere to run, no escape. The chapel had her. But then, in the center of it all, in the heart of the darkness, the altar glimmered again, its pulse steady and unwavering. There was still a flicker of hope, a spark, a possibility. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps as she made a decision. She wasn't going to let this place take her. She wasn't going to give in. Her fingers brushed against the altar once more, and everything went black. Chapter 9. The Descent into Shadows. The darkness took hold of Evelyn with an unrelenting grip, as though the very essence of the chapel had consumed her and swallowed her whole. The faint glimmer from the altar that had briefly offered her hope was gone, snuffed out as quickly as it had appeared. Now only the impenetrable blackness surrounded her, and the oppressive silence echoed in her ears like the hollow sounds of a grave. Her breath caught in her throat, her chest tight with terror. She couldn't move. It was as though the floor beneath her had become quicksand, its unseen force pulling her down deeper, dragging her into a suffocating oblivion. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat sounding louder in the stifling silence, and she realized with a jolt that she couldn't hear the whispers anymore, couldn't hear the voices of the damned that had once filled the chapel. In the absence of sound, a new sensation began to creep into her mind, something worse than the crushing terror that had haunted her since she entered the chapel. It was a feeling, something intangible but pervasive, that twisted at her thoughts like a living thing. She was no longer alone. Something was moving in the shadows. It wasn't the darkness that held her now. It was the presence that lurked within it. The air was thick with it, suffocating her with its cold, malicious energy. A sense of inevitability swept over her as she realized, with dread sinking into her bones, that the chapel had done more than trap her. It had chosen her. She was its new victim, the next to be absorbed into its dark embrace. A low, rumbling laugh echoed around her, deep and guttural, vibrating through the very air. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating in the walls of the chapel, as though the stones themselves had begun to speak. Evelyn's blood ran cold as the laughter morphed into something more sinister. A voice, hoarse and broken, rasping out words she could barely understand. "So fragile! So foolish!" The voice rasped, as if it were savoring each syllable. "Did you think you could escape? Did you think this place would let you go?" Evelyn struggled to move, her body frozen by fear. The voice continued to speak, but this time it was clearer, more precise. She recognized it now. It was the voice of the man who had invited her here, the one who had led her to this place, promising her answers, showing her the truth behind the chapel's cursed history. But there was no truth, no redemption to be found here. Only suffering, only a sacrifice. "You were always meant to be part of this," the voice continued, its tone heavy with malice. "You don't understand. You don't realize what you've walked into. This place, it doesn't just trap you. It feeds off you. And when you become one with it, when it consumes you, you are no longer you. You are part of it. Forever." Evelyn tried to scream, but the sound was strangled, caught in her throat, as if the very chapel was squeezing her voice out of existence. She clawed at the floor beneath her, but the darkness wrapped around her, thick and impenetrable, like chains made of pure night. She could feel them tightening around her wrists, her ankles, pulling her down into the void. It was then that the memories began to surface. Memories she had long buried in the recesses of her mind. Visions of the man who had led her here, his twisted smile, his eyes hollow and empty, gleaming with something she had mistaken for compassion. But it wasn't compassion. It had never been. It was a trap. He had known what would happen to her, and he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to fall into the same fate as the countless others who had dared to set foot in the chapel. She had come to the chapel seeking answers, but answers had never been the goal. "You were always meant to be the next one," the voice said again, drawing Evelyn's attention back to the present, to the growing horror around her. "The chapel has chosen you. There is no escape." In that moment, the world seemed to spin, the air thick with an oppressive force, and Evelyn's vision blurred. She felt herself being drawn deeper into the darkness, each pull like a weight dragging her down into an abyss where there would be no return. But something within her, the same stubborn spark that had kept her moving forward despite the overwhelming odds, refused to yield. She wasn't going to let the chapel claim her. Not like this. Not without a fight. Her mind raced, and she remembered something. Something faint. Something almost lost to her in the midst of the terror. The altar. The strange pulse. The power she had felt emanating from it. She had touched it once before, and something inside it had responded. Could she harness that power now? Could it be the key to escaping the darkness that threatened to swallow her? Evelyn's breath hitched in her chest as she summoned the will to move again. Slowly, painfully, she forced herself to stand, her legs shaking beneath her as though they were made of jelly. The shadows still tried to hold her, still tried to pull her down into the depths, but she gritted her teeth and moved forward. One step at a time. The oppressive air was suffocating, and the whispers, the voices, grew louder, their insistent chanting clawing at her ears. But Evelyn focused, narrowing her mind, locking onto the one thing that might save her. The altar. It was still there. It had to be. She staggered toward it, her body moving on sheer instinct. She felt the darkness tug at her with every step, but she pressed on. The altar wasn't far now. She could feel it, the pulse, the energy that had once reached out to her like a lifeline. When she reached it, she didn't hesitate. She slammed her hands down onto the cold, smooth stone, her fingers digging into its surface. The pulse beneath her touch surged, brighter this time, stronger, as though it were awakening to her presence. The darkness around her seemed to recoil, momentarily retreating as if it feared what she might unleash. "You cannot control it," the voice hissed, its tone dark and threatening. "It will consume you. It will destroy you." But Evelyn didn't listen. She didn't care. The only thing that mattered now was escaping the hell that had been created around her. The pulse beneath her hands grew stronger, until it felt as though the very stone was alive, breathing, beating with a strange and terrible energy. She could feel it coursing through her, filling her, drowning out the fear that had been threatening to consume her. She focused on that energy, channeling it, willing it to break free from the chains that bound her. The darkness was still closing in, but now it seemed to be losing its grip. She was gaining ground. And then, in a burst of light so blinding it seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality, the darkness shattered. The oppressive weight lifted. The voices fell silent. The chapel fell still. Evelyn gasped for air, her lungs burning as though she had been held under water for too long. Her vision cleared, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she saw the chapel in its true form, decaying, ancient, but now strangely lifeless. The shadows were gone, banished by the power she had tapped into. But Evelyn knew the battle wasn't over. It would never truly be over. There would always be more darkness, and she would always be its target. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned away from the altar, every muscle in her body trembling with exhaustion. The way out was still unclear, but one thing was certain: she had won this fight. For now. Chapter 10. The Final Confrontation. Evelyn's chest heaved as she staggered through the chapel's remnants, her every step a slow and deliberate motion, as though she were walking through a nightmare she couldn't quite escape. The air around her was thick with an unnatural stillness, a suffocating silence that pressed against her chest, making it harder to breathe. The once oppressive shadows had dissipated, but in their place lingered something far worse. A sense of anticipation, a feeling that the worst was yet to come. The altar she had clung to for dear life was now little more than a hollow stone slab, cracked and broken with no pulse of energy left to guide her. It had given her hope, and she had seized it, but now that light had faded, leaving her alone in the suffocating quiet. She knew, deep down, that escaping the darkness had been only the beginning. There were no real victories in this place, not yet. For the first time since entering the chapel, Evelyn allowed herself to look around. The walls were crumbling, coated with layers of dust and grime. The once glorious stained glass windows were shattered, their remnants scattered like broken memories. The haunting images of angels and saints had long since lost their power, their beauty shattered by time and malice. The very air seemed to hang heavy with the weight of centuries of suffering. And for a fleeting moment, Evelyn felt an overwhelming sense of despair creep into her bones. But then, like a whisper on the wind, she felt it again, the presence. It wasn't the same as before. The shadows that had consumed her were gone, but something else had taken their place, something colder, something more deliberate. And it was moving toward her. She stiffened, every instinct screaming at her to run, to escape before it was too late. But there was nowhere to go. The door she had entered through had long since disappeared, swallowed by the chapel itself, and the windows were nothing more than jagged voids. No escape, only confrontation. A sudden bone-chilling draft swept through the chapel, carrying with it the faintest trace of a sound. Soft, almost imperceptible. It was a voice, a whisper. "You think you've won?" The voice was low, mocking, dripping with disdain. It seemed to come from every direction at once. "You think that thing could save you? That relic of stone and ancient power? It is nothing compared to me." Evelyn's blood ran cold as she spun around, searching the darkness for the source of the voice. But it was impossible to pinpoint. The chapel was vast, its towering walls and high ceilings filled with shadows that twisted and writhed, stretching unnaturally as if alive. And in the midst of it, the voice seemed to pulse, like the beating heart of something ancient and malignant. "You are weak," the voice continued, now closer, more tangible. "And you will always be weak. The chapel chose you, Evelyn. You are its last vessel, its final offering. You cannot run from what you are." Evelyn's pulse quickened as she stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The words felt like a weight on her soul, pushing her down into the cold, unforgiving stone of the chapel's floor. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the air had thickened around her, suffocating her voice. She was utterly alone. A sudden movement caught her eye, a flicker of motion in the corner of the chapel. The shadows seemed to bend and twist, forming a shape, tall and towering, its features hidden in the depths of the darkness. It was humanoid, but something about it felt wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, as though it were both part of the shadows and yet separate from them. Evelyn's breath hitched as the figure stepped forward, its footfalls making no sound on the cold stone floor. She could feel it now, the presence of something ancient, malevolent, something that had been waiting for this moment. And that moment had finally come. "Do you know what you've unleashed?" the voice whispered, closer now, its form materializing from the shadows. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with features that seemed to shift and writhe, like the face of something caught between worlds. "Do you know what it is to be one with this place?" Evelyn tried to run, but her legs were frozen, her body unwilling to obey. It was as if the very ground beneath her was holding her captive. The shadows seemed to pull at her, each tendril of darkness wrapping around her body, tightening with every breath. "No, Evelyn," the voice whispered, as though reading her thoughts. "You cannot escape now. You've crossed the threshold. You belong here." The figure loomed closer, its form now clear. It was the man who had lured her here. His face was twisted, his eyes black pits of emptiness, his skin pale and cracked like the very walls of the chapel. His lips curled into a grin, but there was no humor in it, only a cruel, mocking satisfaction. "You should have never come," he whispered, stepping toward her, his voice thick with malice. "This chapel is not a place of salvation. It is a prison for the lost, for the damned, for those who seek answers to questions better left unanswered. And now, it has you." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the shadows closed in, pressing against her body, their cold fingers creeping up her limbs. She could feel the weight of the curse descending on her, the inevitable truth she had tried so hard to avoid. She had never been meant to leave this place. The man reached out to her, his fingers like ice as they brushed against her skin. "This is your fate, Evelyn. There is no escape. You are mine." The words reverberated through her soul, and for a moment, she wondered if he was right. Was this the end? Was she destined to become one with the darkness? Was there truly no way out? But then, just as the shadows began to consume her, something inside her, something deep, something primal, fought back. The chapel had taken so much from her already. It had stolen her hope, her courage, and her freedom. But it would not take her spirit. Evelyn's hand shot out, her fingers brushing the remnants of the shattered altar. She felt the energy surge through her once more, that pulse of power that had awakened in her earlier. This time it was stronger, more urgent, more desperate. It was not just the altar's energy now. It was hers. The figure recoiled as the energy surged from her fingertips, the shadows recoiling in fear. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She focused on the altar, on the power within her, and with a cry, she released it. A blinding light exploded from the altar, a searing wave of energy that shattered the darkness, burning through the chapel with the force of 1,000 suns. The figure screamed, a howl of agony and rage as the light engulfed him, burning him from the inside out. But as the light grew, Evelyn felt herself faltering. The energy was powerful, but it was consuming her too. She could feel her strength slipping away, her body weakening with every passing moment. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. And then, in the midst of the chaos, she heard it. The voice. It was no longer the voice of the man, but something older, something more powerful, the true voice of the chapel. "You are strong, Evelyn," it whispered, its tone both awe-filled and mournful, "but not strong enough to escape me." Evelyn's vision blurred as the light continued to blaze around her. She could feel her grip on reality slipping. But she would not give up. Not now. And with a final desperate cry, she pushed everything she had left into the light. The chapel screamed. The walls trembled. The earth beneath her feet shook as the very foundations of the cursed place were torn apart. And then, in an instant, it all went quiet.